student and community health and wellness. And one of my wonderful opportunities is to coordinate community education programs such as this one. So I'm glad that you were able to come and join us. We have a really special program this evening. And I think you'll find it enlightening as well as enjoyable. We're also very lucky because our speaker, John Sharon, will continue to educate us here at McLean tomorrow and speak to our students in the middle school about his abilities model, our abilities model, and his belief in abilities and disabilities working hand in hand. So we're very excited about that. So welcome to the program this evening. I'm going to introduce John now, and we'll begin. We have quite a few more people that are registered, registrants, whatever that is. And we hope they'll be joining us, but we want to respect your time and thank you for being here. So, John Sharon is a native of Washington, D.C. He has been in the field of education since 1986. He leads workshops for the National Institute, the National Association of Independent Schools on abilities. He has a passion for training and educating administrators, teachers, and students on the belief that our disabilities can become our greatest abilities. He is here tonight to share his personal and professional journey with us. So please help me in welcoming John Sharon to McLean School.
Thank you all so much, and thank you to McLean for letting me come here, inviting me. I'm really touched and honored to be here. I've known about McLean for a long, long time, and I went to school in this area. I grew up in this area, as Frankie said, and it's just really neat to actually be here. So it's really fun. Thanks for coming. I wanted to start by explaining a little bit about how I arrived at sort of this topic, this idea of the intersection, for lack of a better term, between disability and identity. For a long time, as Frankie said, I've been speaking at the National Association of Independent Schools Diversity Leadership Institute every summer, and been speaking about a whole bunch of other topics around disability and sort of how our culture sort of views disability. But the progress that we've made, the progress that we haven't made, and one summer a participant said, and as a part of my presentation, I have talked in the past about identity, just briefly, just sort of touched on it. Like, it's a really complicated business, right? This whole idea of, and I think we're going to unpack some of this tonight, like, who are you based on what you look like, based on what you can do, or based on what you can't do? And so we were talking about that, and this participant said, well, who's really talking about disability and identity? And so I went home and I started to do some research, and I'm like, there's really not many people doing that. And then about a month later, I get a phone call from a school in Charlotte, North Carolina, saying, hey, we hear you can do some conference keynote speaking, and we're having a regional conference for middle school, and we'd like you to come and be the keynote. And I said, great, what's the topic? And he said, identity. And I'm like, that's interesting. So I started to just sort of pull some things together, and that's sort of how I arrived at this particular topic. I want to talk a little bit about sort of what we're going to do tonight, because I want you to know that a good chunk of this is going to be a conversation. It's going to be less me talking at you and wanting you to talk to each other and to me, and we can talk to have a conversation. So I'll start with a story, a little bit about me, just because I think it's important, not because you're here to hear about me, but because it's an important framing to the whole conversation. We're going to do some definition about identity, and then we're going to talk about an exploration of what identity means through the lens of ability and disability. And then really what I want to do is have a conversation. And we'll spend a little bit of time also tonight talking about parents. Many of you are parents in this room. How many of you are parents here at McLean? Just a quick show of hands. Great. So we'll be talking a little bit to you specifically, honestly, because I've been thinking about McLean a lot in the last few weeks. So I really want to get into some of that. So I want to start with just a quick word about words. I tend to use the word disability as a default. It's not necessarily that I love the word. The English language, as you all know, is fraught with limitations, it's not accepted practice necessarily in the disability rights community, even there are people who think the word is fine, and there are other people who think the word is not fine. And I just want you to know that where I come from, and where I'm coming from, is that I'm really focusing on people first language, person with a disability. We will talk a little bit about the abilities model as we get into this, but really want to make sure that you all are sort of comfortable with where I'm coming from. That's really where my sort of lens, I guess. So, yes, I was really cute when I was little. My sister's in the back; she can attest to the fact that anyway, quick little bit of my story, and I'm going to sort of focus it primarily through the lens of my educational journey, because that's really why you're here, right? That's the primary focus and reason you're here. So 1964, I was born in Washington, D.C. with a condition called arthrogryposis multiplex congenita. God bless you. And it was a really rare condition, is still a rare condition. 1 out of every 88,000 births, I think, which statistically speaking is super rare. The word, the name comes, arthro means joint, gryposis means curvature. That sort of makes sense when you look at me. Multiplex means that my mom caught it when she was pregnant at a movie theater. No, just kidding. That's my wife's joke. I've been told that, my wife is here tonight too, sorry. I've been told that I never give her credit for the jokes that I steal from her, so let it be known that I have actually given her credit. And then congenita means from birth. And so when I was born, 6 doctors said to my mom that I wasn't going to live. And to the best of my knowledge, I like to say all 6 of those doctors are now dead. And so much for modern medicine, right? And they said that if I did live, I wasn't going to walk, and regardless of whether I walked, if I did live, chances were really good. They said that I was going to be mentally retarded. They used that terrible term back then. That what they advised my mom to do is to put me into a mental institution and sort of go on with the rest of her life. And that was the advice back in 1964. Big parentheses, pause for a minute. I'm on a Facebook group with a bunch of people with arthrogryposis and a bunch of parents who have kids with arthrogryposis. And doctors are still giving that advice to new parents that that chances are so good that these kids are going to have cognitive disabilities. And so that advice is still going on in 2020. Just saying. Okay, end of soapbox. My mom used to come, the story goes that my mom used to come down to the hospital every day to feed me, and she would make these little noises that she noticed that my reaction was exactly the same as my older sisters who didn't have disabilities. And she figured out pretty quickly that there was really nothing wrong with my brain, and she said to these doctors that I was going to go home with her. And lately I've sort of been thinking a little bit more. I try not to let my brain go there, but I've lately been letting my brain go there a little bit of kind of what would my life have been like if I had started out that way, right? And what in that environment, use your imagination of what an institutional environment would be like in 1964. In that environment, how much of that environment would I have begun to pick up? How much of that environment would I have been able to let go? Would anybody have noticed that there was nothing wrong with my brain? So that isn't my story, but I do think about that a lot. I sort of think, gosh, it's absolutely remarkable that my mother, who didn't really have much beyond a high school education, knew enough and was sort of forceful enough to stand up to these doctors and say, nope, that's not the way this story is going to end. So I began this life, the way I sort of describe it is being 100% fully aware that I was different from everybody else from as long as I can remember anything. But I also remember feeling 100% aware that I was the same as everybody else too. And so one of my earliest memories actually was my mom carrying me, because I didn't really start walking until I was about 4 or 5. She was carrying me out of Georgetown Hospital, and she starts yelling at somebody across the parking lot, and I don't know what she was yelling. I don't remember that, but it was something about staring. Somebody was obviously staring. So I just knew instinctively as a 4-year-old or 4 years old that they were staring at me. But I also knew, because I was sort of born into this amazing family that just wouldn't allow this to define me. That I knew from as early as I can remember that I was 100% the same as everybody else too. So the way that I sort of describe this, and I'll talk about this with the middle schoolers tomorrow, is sort of living in the worlds of same and different at the same time. 100% same, 100% different. And navigating these two worlds, sometimes in the same instant, which is a little tricky, but and we'll get into that maybe later, but very much an important part of my journey then and my journey now. I mean, I still live in the world of same and different. And there are moments when I forget that I have a disability. Ask my wife later. She'll tell you all kinds of things that she gets upset with me about because I'm pretending, or not pretending, but I'm just sort of ignoring it. And now that I'm getting older, that's a whole other talk and a whole other presentation. So the goal for me was, I did have a doctor. I don't want to disparage all doctors, but because I did have an orthopedist who figured out pretty early on that I probably had the muscle strength to get into leg braces. So they did lots of surgeries when I was young to get feet and legs a little bit straighter so that I could get into leg braces and get up and walk. Because the goal was for me to go to school. The goal was for me to go to that was really the important goal. And think about it. Think about how accessible our world was back in 1964, 1970. Life in a wheelchair probably wasn't in the offing, even if that was in the offing. And so, lots of surgeries, got into leg braces, went to school, and the first place I went to school was a place, it was run by the Easter Seals, and it was called the DC Society for Crippled Children. And you got to remember, I was sort of, as I said, I was in this family that sort of nobody sort of allowed me to focus on the difference. So I was living in the world of same, and then I go to this school for kindergarten, and I'm suddenly thrust into the way I look at it is the world of different. And I'm like, whoa, why am I here? I don't belong here. And I'm not proud of this moment. I mean, I really have to own this publicly because I just felt like I'm not like them. I'm not like them. And I look back on it now, and I think I was actually misbehaving quite a bit, trying to get kicked out of kindergarten. And I didn't get kicked out, but I did convince my mom that I didn't think that school was right for me. And so the following year, I went to Beauvoir. You probably know about Beauvoir School. And Beauvoir, thoroughly inaccessible place. In fact, they hired the groundskeeper to carry me up and down stairs my first year, maybe first 2 years, as a first and second grader. And there were others who were hired to do that as well. And as you can imagine, think about this. Now I think I'm coming from the world of same, and I think I'm going into the world of same, Beauvoir, and suddenly, guess what happens? I mean, you can figure that you know the answer. You know this, right? You just know how this story goes, right? The teasing, the mocking, the ostracism, blah 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 blah. And I'm not here to tell you pity stories, I promise. But it was really hard. I'm not gonna lie. And I used to go home and say, yeah, I'm not sure this school's right for me either. I'm sure my mother was ready to throw me out the window. And so she used to say something which was really, I didn't believe her and I didn't like it. but for those of you who are kids in the room, your mothers are always right. I'm just going to say this, okay? Yeah, I saw the elbow poke. She used to say, you just have to give them time. They have to get used to you. You've got more maturity than they do. They will figure this out. And she was right. In fact, sort of the irony of my story in some ways is that by the time I got to middle school, I know I'm fast forwarding a lot really quick, but by the time I got to middle school, I'd been going to school with some of those people for a long time. And they knew me and I knew them, and we really got along really well. So all of the stereotypes of the yucky middle school experience because somebody's got, whether it's a disability or a pimple on their chin, it didn't really work with me because I generally had a pretty good experience in middle school. But it still wasn't easy being at that school and feeling that kind of ostracism. And then I went on to St. Albans after Beauvoir, and school was hard for me. I mean, I wasn't a very good student, first of all. In fact, I think there was a report card from a teacher that I stumbled upon a few years ago that said something like, if John cared as much about school as he did about sports, these grades would be amazing. So, but that wasn't me at the time. I think we'll come back to that, I think, in a minute. But there were times when I really struggled in school, and there were times when I really sort of wanted to feel sorry for myself. And there was one time when I was in 6th grade and I was at recess and I looked around and I had a spelling test after recess and I didn't want to take it, and I looked around and I didn't see anybody, and so I just sort of made myself fall down. And I worked up a really good set of tears, and I went into Mr. Bernard's classroom and I said, Mr. Bernard, I fell and I can't take the spelling test. And he kind of looked at me and he's like, you fell right outside my window. I saw the whole thing, and I saw you do it on purpose. You're going to take the spelling test. It sounds kind of cruel and heartless, but you know what? It was exactly the kind of kick in the pants that I needed, right? And another incident from 6th grade that I think was kind of telling, not to contradict what I said before, but 6th grade, I was really into soccer. I still am, and I was a big fan of soccer, and I loved playing the sport. It was a sport that I could play, and so back then we did this winter intramural soccer league, and back then they let the kids pick the teams. So I mean, again, you kind of know where that's going to go without me even telling you. So sure enough, yes, I got picked last, and this guy said, "Oh man, we're really gonna lose now because we've got him on our team." And I was sort of like, and I was having a bad week already. Maybe it was the same week as the spelling test. I don't know. But I walked off the field. I was like, I'm done. I don't need this, right? And the athletic director at the time, who was running the program, he's like, look, if you walk off, I'll never forget it. He said, if you walk off the field, that means that he's won. I'm like, okay, so he made me come back. And he made me and this guy, Tom, sit on a bench across from each other. And he said, Tom, I want you to tell John everything that you like and admire about him as a person. And I'm loving this. This is like, because Tom's totally squirming and he does not like this. And he's really, and so I don't even remember what he said, but he said something. And I'm getting up to leave. And he's like, no. John, you now have to say, look at Tom and tell him everything that you admire and like about him. And I'm like, what? Are you kidding? So we did, and we kind of hemmed our way through that. And by the end of that season, and by the end of the year, and later in subsequent years, he and I actually became friends. Because that athletic director made us look at each other and talk about what we admired about each other, not what we didn't. Not the limitations that we saw, but actually the gifts that we saw. And that's a really important piece that we're going to come back to later. So fast forward, the goal for me was really to get independent enough so that I could go off to college. And so I worked really hard with a lot of help, but I worked really hard at getting fully independent so that I could go away to college. I really wanted to prove that I could. And so I learned how to dress myself and the bathing stuff and all that stuff, and learned how to drive a car and all of those things. And then, so I did. I went off to college, and I got to college, and suddenly, for some of these guys that I was in high school with, I had been going to school with since before, right? And so then I go to college, and there's nobody with a physical disability on that campus, at least visible disability on that campus. And so I get to that college, and I'm like, first of all, everybody knew who I was, which was the weirdest thing on the planet, right? It was like everybody knew my name, and I didn't know any of these people. And they knew who I was because I looked different, right? It wasn't because I was stunningly cute. It was because I looked different. So the joke was that I thought as a freshman in college, hey, there's a presidential election, a class president election coming up. I should run for president. That would be really funny because all these people, they know who I am. And the joke ended up being on me because I won the stupid election. And I hated being class president. I really did. It was just terrible. But to give you an indication of my kind of awakening to this particular thing, this thing called me and my disability, Connecticut College, where I went, was just not. There was no accessibility at Connecticut College, none whatsoever. It was before the Americans with Disabilities Act, so they didn't need to be. There were the main administration building had classrooms up on the 4th floor, and it was just ridiculous. Lots and lots of stairs, but I didn't really notice, surprisingly enough, and. I remember one day I was coming out of that administration building, and I had some friends who were taking an education class, and they said, John, what do you think about the accessibility of this school? And I'm like, what are you talking about? Well, how do you get around? It's like, I walk up and down the stairs. Well, but this campus is terrible. And I'm like, it is? I didn't have a clue. It's just like unbelievable how clueless I was. And so I started really looking around and paying attention. I'm like, gosh, this campus is terrible. This is awful. And so I started making a little noise. I started making some noise with the administration. One year we did a disability awareness week where we rented wheelchairs from local pharmacies, and we asked 5 or 10 students to spend a week in wheelchairs going to classes. And the rule was that if you had a class on the 4th floor of the administration building, you couldn't just get out and walk. You had to be carried up the stairs and then carried back down the stairs. And that was we did that. Ended the week, I think, with this big wheelchair race down the center of campus, which was really fun. Just before that big day of the races and stuff, I got word that the administration, we had called some local media people to come and cover this, and I had gotten word that the school administration had called all the media and said that the day had been canceled. No, it hadn't. But they didn't want the bad press because they were afraid of a lawsuit. And so we called all the radio stations back and the TV stations back, and we said, no, the day is on, we're going. So, but it was really interesting. And another story I'll tell you from the college sort of days is that I got this, people knew that I was starting to make some noise about accessibility, and they were building a new gymnasium. So the athletic director knew that I was interested in it, and he said, hey, would you like to have lunch with the architect of the new building? And I was like, sure, that'd be great. And so the day before the lunch, again, this is all before the Americans with Disabilities Act, so the building didn't have to be accessible, right? The day before the lunch, I snuck down into the construction site, and I looked around, and I noticed that beautiful new gym and lots of amazing things, and downstairs there was a squash court and some other stuff, and there's no elevator in the building. So I went to have my lunch with the architect the next day, and I said, Mr. Architect, you have a really nice building here, but why isn't there an elevator going down to the squash court? And he looks at me and he says, well, why would somebody in a wheelchair want to go to the squash court? And I said, to play squash? Now, I had never seen somebody play squash in a wheelchair at that point, but it was sort of flabbergasting to me that he hadn't even thought that to be possible. And I got really discouraged, honestly. It's like, okay, this guy is an architect, and he's building buildings, and he's not thinking this way, and he's really thinking about one particular aspect of mobility, the able-bodied, right? And so that was really hard for me, but it really did in fact propel me to start doing some of this education work that I've been doing in some ways ever since. And one of the things that I've noticed over the years is that, as I've done this work, is that even now, after we have the Americans with Disabilities Act, even now, after we have a fair amount of wokeness among our culture, we still have a long way to go. We have people in our culture who live really limiting lives because the culture says they need to be limiting, and we have lots of there is still a lot of inaccessibility in the world, both literal physical accessibility as well as attitudinal inaccessibility, and maybe we'll get into that in a little bit. So anyway, so we're going to sort of shift a little bit now into this whole exploration of the topic of identity. And you know, an identity and disability is really complicated, as I said earlier. This idea of, well, who am I? When you look at me, when people first look at me, they see something, they see me through the lens of limitation. That's what we normally do. When we look at somebody, especially somebody who has a noticeable, visible physical disability, we think limitation. We don't think gifts, we don't think ability, we think the lack of it. And yet, if you know, when I'm asked, say, who are you, and you're in the identity kind of questions, the disability thing for me is one of the last things that I talk about. It's just, I mean, I know I need to probably talk about it more, but I don't. But you know, I'm a husband, I'm a father, I'm a son, I'm a brother, I'm a teacher, I'm a school administrator, I'm a musician, whatever. The disability thing doesn't come. And so it's really complicated because a lot of what I want to talk about tonight is this idea of what is identity anyway, and how does that identity, how do we make sense of identity through the lens of the assumptions that people make? So what is identity? So identity, psychologists say, identity is the self, the expressions of individuality and the groups to which people belong. That's a pretty good definition of identity, right? Think about that for a minute. However, that definition assumes that you know who you are, and it also assumes that you get to pick who you are. And sometimes, not everybody gets to pick. Okay? So let's do a little exercise. I want you to turn to somebody sitting near you, and you may have to get up and move if you're not sitting near somebody, but I really want you to do this. And I want you to talk to your neighbor about a time when somebody made an assumption about you that was not true. Do that for about a minute or two, and then I'll tell you to switch, and then we'll have a conversation. So talk about a time when somebody made an assumption about you that was not true. Okay?
Yeah.
Well, actually, it was like a pretty recent time where, like, I guess I misunderstood a question to like an opposite way, but it's like the same question. And the priest, honestly, it wasn't negative because the priest who I was talking to kind of thought, you know, like, that's like how you can see different things to a question. And so he told me about this story, you know, that like many people didn't think he was smart, but he's really creative in a different way. You know, they're like count like all the L's or like all the maybe all the I's in like Rudolph or Rudolph's reindeer, and he goes and he starts going like instead of like actually just counting the title, and I was like, that's like perfect sense to me.
That's so funny. That's so funny. I'm trying to think of a time. I'm so like, I don't know, it doesn't occur to me that people are perceiving me differently.
Make sure you have time to switch. Make sure you make time to switch.
I'm not much of an athlete. Like, I like playwriting, but like how after I'm like terrible stage fright, so like I don't know. It's like what's also weird is that I'll be afraid until like the last minute, and then I'll be like, okay, let's do this.
So you have to just kind of get past it.
Yeah.
And start whatever you're supposed to do.
That is, speaking is definitely one of them. Like, I know many people who are terrified of speaking. And my dad is like the one person I know who isn't terrified at all.
I would say John's probably terrified of speaking. Actually, I was just thinking about it. This makes me sometimes like every guy, I'm like, why was I nervous about this? I don't know, it's just worse to have the confidence and then be like, or to be nervous, like start doing it and go. I don't know, it's just that really understanding. Yes. That's what I remember about John, because he was an amazing harmonica player. Do you still play?
I haven't done it in a while.
So you're not going to You're getting better? You're the first harmonica player I know.
Which is precisely why you thought I was amazing. You just needed to get out more.
I don't know many
Okay, I'm going to bring you back. Sorry to interrupt. Sounds like there were really good conversations going on. Any brave souls want to share? Wait, what am I supposed to share? You don't have to. I'm not making anybody.
Just try not to make eye contact.
Try not to make eye contact. Don't make eye contact. Don't make it. Yes, in the back. Nice and loud.
2 years ago, some of my classmates, and this happened also with some of my other classmates, they would say, how were you brought to America, or were you from Mexico, or something like that. So my list would be questions, and I would say, I'm adopted from Guatemala, and, I'm proud to be adopted. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you for being brave to speak tonight. That's awesome. Anybody else? I'm not forcing anybody. I promise. So it's really interesting to me that the idea of the assumptions that people make, and when do we start to believe those assumptions? I mean, maybe that's another sort of layer to this. Is it's not true, but they think it's true. When do those assumptions actually start to become true for you, even though you know deep down that you know those aren't true, right? And usually this idea of identity and assumptions about people get done for people with disabilities, with visible people with visible disabilities, based on what they can't do. Also, in the invisible world of invisible disabilities, cognitive issues, learning issues, whatever you want to talk about, those are real, right? And some of you, I'm sure, know that. Now, before I give you this next definition of identity, one thing that you should know is that there has been an explosion in the last probably 10 years of disability studies in colleges and universities around the country, and actually around the world. I think the number of disabilities, this was probably 2 years ago, the number of disability studies majors now, schools that offer that as a major, is like 110. It was 0 10 years ago. So that's pretty amazing. So there are people actually doing this work, which is really fun. And identity has actually become an important part of some of this work. And so there's a group of researchers, I believe they're in Toronto, and their sort of a definition of identity through the lens of disability is this. Disability entails, identity entails a positive sense of self, feelings of connection to or solidarity with the disability community. A coherent disability identity is believed to help individuals adapt to disability, including navigating related social stresses and daily hassles. I mean, it's a good definition, but it doesn't, the limitation for me on this definition is that it assumes that all of, to borrow a line from Beverly Tatum, all of the disabled kids are going to sit together in the cafeteria. And they're probably not, actually. I mean, if my experience is any indication, people with disabilities don't tend to hang out together. They want to be treated like everybody else. And they don't want to be sort of put to the side and I mean, this is just a really complicated thing. You see why this is so complicated? But here's the reality. The reality is that identity and disability is a dance, right? Or maybe this picture is better. It's a dance. It's a dance between who you say that I am and who I think I am, and we kind of dance about it. Sometimes I get to lead and sometimes I don't. And a lot of times when I don't, it's usually because people are being jerks. But the one of the things that I'm going to talk a lot about tomorrow is with the middle schoolers is this whole idea, the way we get past this, is this whole idea of normalizing imperfection. Right? See, we live in this Insta-snap twit-face world, right? Where we are all adults. Kids in the room, guess what? Adults are really good at this too. We manage our images all the time. That's all we do, right? And we manage sort of how we try to be perfect. And the bottom line is that we're not perfect. And the bottom line is that there's no such thing as and the previous definition actually sort of says this, there's no such thing as sort of a hassle-free life. And in fact, I'm going to take it a step further. I actually believe that disability is a fundamental part of the human condition. It's a radical statement. But I'll tell you why. I'll just briefly illustrate why I think this way. This is not based on research. This is just based on a couple of stories, but really interesting. So whenever I travel and I take Ubers, I love to talk to Uber drivers. That's one of my favorite things to do in the world. Sort of, who are you? What do you do? How'd you get here? Or whatever. And for the last 2 summers actually, coming down to Alexandria to speak at the Diversity Leadership Conference, I was taking an Uber from the hotel to the conference, and the first time this happened, I was talking to the driver, and I said, oh, so, he said he wanted to know why I was going to this conference, and I said, well, I'm going to this conference on diversity, and I'm going to talk about disability and diversity. And he said, he kind of got quiet, and he said, well, that's really interesting. I have a disability. And I said, oh, tell me more about it. And he said, well, I was an Iraqi war veteran, and I made it fine through my tour of duty, and then I came back, and I parachuted out of an airplane, and my parachute didn't open. And I fell, and I broke my back. I guess it opened partially, so he didn't die. But he broke his back, and now he has a permanent disability. So I'm like, wow, that's really interesting. And we talked about that. So then so I go into the conference. Later that night, I'm taking an Uber back to the hotel. And I'm talking to the driver. And he asked me, he wants to know what I'm doing at this conference. And I said, well, this is what I'm doing. And he says, that's really interesting. I've got 5 kids, and all of them have learning disabilities. And I do too. Really? And so we started, and I wanted to talk to him about that, and we talked about his kids' schooling and what they're struggling with and what their triumphs are. And so I'm like, this is just weird. So then the following year, I'm not making this up, I promise. The following year, I'm at the same conference. Must be the neighborhood, I don't know. But different Uber driver. We're talking, and he goes, "What are you doing at this conference?" And he's from Pakistan, and he's really interested in me talking at this conference because he has a 12-year-old son with cerebral palsy. And they had to leave Pakistan because to have cerebral palsy in Pakistan was just not an okay thing, and they had to come here. And so I kind of came out of that. I put all these 3 rides together, and I'm like, really? Like, so maybe that's really what's going on here, is that maybe disability is actually a part of the human condition. I mean, I could be really cynical here and say that those of you who think that you're able-bodied, technically what people in the disability community call you are tabs, temporarily able-bodied, because eventually you will not be able-bodied, for whatever reason. And there's also something really profound here, I think, that maybe we can talk about in the conversation later, about the fact that I'm a firm believer that disability builds empathy in others. It gives people the gift to have empathy for other people. And it doesn't make it easy, and it doesn't make it right, but I do believe it makes it purposeful. That empathy, so for stupid illustration, but I'll give it to you. So if I were to fall down, I could probably figure out how to get up, crawl up on a chair, but I would need you to help me. I would need you to sort of come into my world for a minute and help me, right? And so if I didn't have this disability, I wouldn't need you. But there's more to that story, right? You actually don't know this, but you have a need to help me, even though you don't know you have that need. And then let's bend your mind even further. I have a need to let you help me. So do you see that? Yeah, what a complex idea that is. It's like, it almost makes my brain hurt. But it's a really, we tend to treat disability and difference in this culture as something to be cured, or something to be avoided, or something to be sort of put away, right? And I actually think disability has a really profound purpose in human interaction. Which sort of leads me to the kind of the title slide in some ways of sort of who gets to tell your story. And the reason that I sort of use this phrase is because especially when I talk to kids, that there so many times kids are defined by, I mean, maybe adults too, defined by the perceptions and the attitudes and the assumptions of other people. And when that happens, basically, we allow others to write the story for us. And what my answer to this question, there's only one person who gets to tell your story, and that's you. And especially if you're a kid in the room, don't let anybody otherwise tell you, because that's just not okay. So I'm going to wrap this up, I promise, so we can start talking. But I have been really sort of been thinking a lot about the abilities model here at McLean, and how does it fit into all this? And there's a couple of thoughts that I wanted to share with you, and then we'll talk a little bit about parenting, and then we'll stop. The first thing is that the abilities model really clearly, in my view, focuses on strength. It really does come from a place of strength and not limitation. And so therefore, I mean, my dream is that all schools, and I'm an educator, all schools should be doing the abilities model for every kid everywhere. Because if all we're doing is focusing on students and their weaknesses or their lack of strength, then we do them a huge disservice in terms of them figuring out who they are as students, right? The other piece to this is that I think that a model like this really it assumes competence. It really does. It assumes that there isn't incompetence. It assumes competence, and that's a huge piece to getting someone to own their story. And speaking of owning your story, I also then therefore believe that the abilities model promotes authorship of one's story. It's as simple in some ways as that. But then what about parents? Because I know there's parents in the audience, and I want to talk a little bit with you about parenting, and especially parenting a child with a disability. I think one of the things that I think is really important to know is that parenting in general is terrifying. It's just the most terrifying work that I've ever done. But in some of this I'm drawing on my work as a school administrator. But the idea of parent as coach versus parent as agent. In my school, I see a lot of parents as agents. They serve as professional agents. I think sports agents, if that'll help you understand what I'm talking about. They serve as professional agents for their children. They're trying to, we call them snowplow parents. They plow away all obstacles out of their children's way. They assume, without even knowing it, they assume incompetence sometimes because they're afraid that the school doesn't get their child. And I totally understand why that would be. There's lots of reasons that they would feel that way. But if you think about the parent as a coach rather than as an agent, I'm a nationally licensed soccer coach. You don't need a national license to coach soccer, I promise. But I've done a lot of coaching in soccer in my life, and I can have in previous years I've had really, really gifted athletes, and I've had really not so gifted athletes on my teams, and I can't go out and do the playing for them. I can help do everything that I can to get them ready for the game, but I can't do it for them, right? And if I could do it for them, okay, then even if I could pretend, then I'm getting mad at them for their inability to perform. How stupid is that? Because that's really not my place, right? I'm a coach. I'm not in the game. I'm on the sidelines. And sometimes I feel like, parents, for all good, really good reasons, parents will want to do the hard work for the kid, and sometimes you just can't. Other thing that we need to talk about is this whole idea of fear versus fear of failure. One of the things that I've really learned to embrace as an educator, and we're really pushing hard at my school now, is to actually sort of talk freely and openly about this concept of failure. And it's really countercultural for a school. It's really countercultural for an independent school. Man, big money here, and you're telling me that it's okay to fail? No, it's not really what I mean. What I'm talking about here is the idea of the freedom to make mistakes, the freedom to struggle. And this is what I love about the abilities model, is because the abilities model, at least from my understanding of it, is that because it's focusing on strengths and competence, then it almost assumes that there's going to be failure. You can't become competent without, and strong in a sense, without first failing. There's that whole idea of sort of failing forward. I worked for a head of school once who had a motto for us on his administrative team of new mistakes, he said. That's all he said, new mistakes. And I'm like, wait, what? And he said, look, we're all going to make mistakes. He said, just make sure you don't make the same mistake twice. And that was a permission to fail, right? And I think it's really hard for us as parents, but we do have to occasionally give our children the permission to fail. A lot of times they won't take that failure, but at least they have permission. And the last thing I want to say about this is this idea of it's a phrase. It comes from a title of a book that was on my coffee table last week, and I was putting this presentation together, and I'm like, wait, that's exactly what I want to talk about here. Every Step at Arrival actually comes from a poem by a woman named Denise Lesertoff, and it's about a dog who's sort of on a walk, And if you have dogs, you'll know that dogs on a walk will like have a really circuitous way to get to their destination. First they go over here, and then they go over here and sniff over here for a while, and they sniff over here. And in some ways, that's a little bit like being a parent of a child. Because every step, and so the poem says that for the dog, every step is an erotic. And a lot of times I think, and it's certainly in my experience with parents, in my work, you know, I see parents as really only focused on the end product, not on the journey. And what I love about the abilities model is it embraces the journey as much as it does the destination. So the last slide that I'll have before we open it up is just that this is really what I'm after here. This is the idea, this is the sign language sign for welcome. We talk a lot about inclusion, and I think inclusion is a great word, but think about the difference between inclusion and belonging. What does it mean to be included? What does it mean to belong? I heard once a definition that I really like of what does it mean to belong. And this guy said, when you know you belong, when you're missed when you're not there. Isn't that beautiful? I just love that. You know you belong when you're missed when you're not there. And you know, my goal in when I go to schools and sort of share some of my story and talk about some of this stuff is to really try to move the needle for schools to move away from inclusion and embrace the idea of belonging in their DEI work and their diversity work and all of the other work that they do. Because it's such a powerful thing when a student feels like she or he belongs. So I've thrown a lot at you in the last 50-ish minutes or so. And some of it is coherent, some of it wasn't, but that's okay. I want to hear what you want to talk about. I'm really curious about your observations, questions, thoughts that you have about any of it. And I'm very comfortable in silent space. So I'll give you a minute.